The silence in the briefing room was the kind that made careers end. Lieutenant Colonel Kiera Phoenix Valdez stood at attention, her flight suit crisp despite the 18-hour mission that had ended 3 hours ago. Around her, the assembled officers, all male, all white, all radiating the kind of institutional confidence that came with never having to prove themselves twice, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Nellis Air Force Base, casting long shadows across the polished conference table where classified folders lay sealed. "So let me get this straight," Colonel Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of 23 years in the cockpit and the bitter edge of a man who'd been passed over for promotion once too often. "You're telling us that Lieutenant Colonel Valdez here," he paused, letting his eyes sweep over her compact frame, the silver wings on her chest, the ribbon rack that told stories most of them had only heard whispered in squadron bars, took out an entire enemy air defense network with a single F-35. Alone. The intelligence officer, Captain Reynolds, cleared his throat. "Sir, the satellite imagery confirms." "I can read satellite imagery, Captain." Morrison's interruption was sharp. "What I can't understand is how someone who's spent more time fighting Pentagon bureaucrats than enemy fighters suddenly becomes our silver bullet." Kiera's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The nickname had followed her through 3 commands, whispered in ready rooms and painted on bathroom walls. The diversity hire, the quota filler, the woman who'd taken a spot from a more deserving man. She'd heard it all before, had learned to let it roll off her shoulders like rain on her aircraft's composite skin, but today felt different. Today, the weight of what she'd done 12 hours ago over the desert of an unnamed hostile nation pressed against her chest like G-forces in a tight turn. "The mission parameters were clear," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her hands. "Neutralize the SA-21 battery, minimize collateral damage, return to base." She paused, meeting Morrison's gaze. "Mission accomplished." "Mission accomplished," Morrison repeated, his tone suggesting he found the words distasteful. Just like that, no support, no backup, no coordination with the strike package that was supposed to. The door burst open. Every officer in the room snapped to attention as the unmistakable sound of boot heels announced the arrival of someone whose presence changed the very air pressure in the room. The 4 stars on the incoming officer's collar caught the morning light like signals from a distant constellation. The transformation was immediate and profound. Backs straightened. Conversations died. The electricity of military hierarchy crackled through the space like lightning before thunder. Colonel Morrison's face went pale, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Even Captain Reynolds, who'd been shuffling papers with bureaucratic efficiency moments before, stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. But it was what happened next that would be talked about in squadron-ready rooms for decades to come. General Patricia Hammer Castellanos, the Air Force's most decorated combat pilot, the first woman to command a fighter wing in combat, the legend who'd earned her reputation in the skis over Iraq and Afghanistan, walked directly to where Kiera stood. The general's footsteps echoed in the silence like the rhythm of a funeral march, each step deliberate, each movement carrying the weight of authority that could end careers or launch them into legend. Without breaking eye contact, without acknowledging the stunned silence of the assembled officers, General Castellanos came to attention. Her hand moved to her brow in a salute so sharp, so precise, that it could have cut glass. "Lieutenant Colonel Valdez," she said, her voice carrying across the room like a prayer. "It's an honor to salute a pilot who reminded the world what American air power can do when it's in the right hands." The silence that followed was different from the one before. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of skepticism or the tense atmosphere of military politics. This was the profound stillness that comes when the world shifts on its axis, when assumptions crumble and new realities are born. In that moment, every officer in the room understood that they were witnessing history. Not just the recognition of a successful mission, but the acknowledgement of something far more significant. Colonel Morrison's face had gone from pale to ashen. The same man who'd questioned Kira's abilities minutes before now looked like he'd seen a ghost. Captain Reynolds had gone completely still, his papers forgotten in his hands. The other officers, majors and lieutenant colonels who'd built their careers on the assumption that the old ways were the only ways, stared in stunned silence. General Castellanos held her salute for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. When she finally lowered her hand, the sound seemed to echo in the room. "At ease, everyone," she said, her voice carrying the easy authority of someone who'd never had to prove herself to anyone. "I think we have some debriefing to do." But the debriefing would come later. Right now, in this moment, something fundamental had changed. The woman they'd dismissed as a diversity hire, the pilot they'd underestimated and marginalized, had just received the highest form of military respect from one of the most revered officers in the Air Force. And everyone in that room knew that their assumptions about Lieutenant Colonel Kira Phoenix Valdez had just gone up in smoke. To understand how this moment came to pass, how a woman who'd been fighting for respect her entire career suddenly found herself at the center of a military legend, you have to go back. Back to the beginning, to the small town in New Mexico where a little girl first looked up at the sky and decided she was going to fly. Back to the challenges and setbacks, the discrimination and doubt, the moments when quitting would have been easier than fighting. Back to the forging of a pilot who would one day change everything. The story of Phoenix began long before that morning at Nellie's. It began with a dream, a determination, and the unshakable belief that the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. It began with a girl who refused to be grounded by the limitations others tried to place on her. It began with the making of a legend, one flight hour at a time. In the high desert of New Mexico, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the sky seems to touch the earth, 11-year-old Kira Valdez pressed her nose against the chain-link fence surrounding Kirtland Air Force Base. The thunderous roar of an F-16 taking off shook the ground beneath her feet, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she watched with the kind of intensity that comes from pure, undiluted wonder as the fighter jet carved its path through the brilliant blue sky, leaving nothing but contrails and the echo of afterburners. Her father, Staff Sergeant Miguel Valdez, stood beside her, his maintenance uniform still smelling of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. "Mija," he said softly, using the term of endearment that had followed her since birth, "you know what it takes to fly one of those." Kira didn't take her eyes off the sky. "Everything," she whispered. Miguel smiled, recognizing something in his daughter's voice that reminded him of himself at that age. The certainty, the hunger, the absolute conviction that some dreams were worth any sacrifice. "Everything," he agreed, "and then some." The base had been Miguel's world for over a decade. He'd enlisted straight out of high school, trading the uncertainty of civilian life for the structured purpose of military service. His specialty was avionics, the electronic systems that turned flying machines into weapons of war. He could troubleshoot a radar system blindfolded, repair a targeting computer with nothing but determination and spare parts. But he'd never flown. Never felt the kick of afterburners pushing him back into his seat. Never experienced the god-like perspective that came with looking down at the world from 30,000 feet. His daughter, however, had been born with wings. From the moment she could walk, Kira had been drawn to anything that left the ground. Paper airplanes, kites, even the occasional insect that dared to fly through their backyard. Everything that defied gravity captured her imagination. By age 7, she could identify aircraft by their silhouettes. By 9, she knew the specifications of every fighter jet in the Air Force inventory. By 11, she'd already decided that flying wasn't just what she wanted to do, it was who she was meant to be. The decision hadn't been easy for Miguel. In 1995, combat roles for women were still severely limited. The glass ceiling wasn't just present, it was reinforced concrete. But when he looked at his daughter, when he saw the way her eyes tracked aircraft across the sky with the precision of a targeting system, he knew that trying to redirect her passion would be like trying to stop the wind. "You know it won't be easy," he told her one evening as they sat on their back porch, watching the sunset paint the Sandia Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "People will tell you that you don't belong. They'll question everything you do, every decision you make. They'll look for reasons why you can't instead of reasons why you can." Kiera, now 13, and already showing the kind of confidence that would either take her to the top or destroy her completely, turned to face her father. "Did you let people tell you that you didn't belong?" Miguel considered this. His own journey hadn't been without obstacles. Growing up in a working-class Hispanic family in Albuquerque, he'd faced his share of discrimination and doubt. But his challenges had been different, economic rather than gender-based, cultural rather than institutional. "That's different, Mija. What you're talking about is harder," Kira interrupted. "I know, but hard isn't the same as impossible." It was a philosophy that would define her entire career. Hard wasn't impossible. Challenging wasn't insurmountable. Difficult wasn't defeat. These concepts became the foundation of her character, the bedrock upon which she'd build a career that would eventually make her a legend. The path to that legend began in high school, where Kira threw herself into every program that could prepare her for military aviation. ROTC, Advanced Mathematics, Physics, Physical Fitness. She approached each with the same intensity she'd once reserved for watching jets take off. Her grades were immaculate, her fitness scores outstanding, her leadership evaluations exceptional. But it was her scores on the pilot aptitude tests that truly set her apart. "I've never seen numbers like this," said Colonel James Fletcher, the ROTC instructor who'd become something of a mentor to Kira. "Your spatial reasoning, your reaction times, your ability to process multiple inputs simultaneously, these are the kind of scores that make careers." But scores, as Kira would learn, were only part of the equation. The other part was politics, perception, and the uncomfortable reality that progress in the military came slowly, reluctantly, and usually only after someone had fought hard enough to force change. The first real test came during her senior year, when she applied for the Air Force Academy. Her application was flawless: grades, fitness, leadership recommendations. But the interview process revealed the challenges that lay ahead. The board of officers, all male, all from an era when women in combat roles were unthinkable, asked questions that had nothing to do with her qualifications and everything to do with their assumptions about her limitations. "Miss Valdez," said Colonel Harrison, a man whose chest displayed ribbons from conflicts dating back to Vietnam, "how do you think male pilots will react to taking orders from a woman?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Kira felt the weight of it, understood that her answer would determine not just her fate, but potentially the fate of other women who would sit in this same chair, facing this same question, in years to come. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, "I think competent pilots will react to taking orders from a competent officer. Gender won't enter into it once we're in the cockpit. And if you're wrong, then I'll prove myself until gender stops being relevant." The silence that followed was telling. Some of the officers exchanged glances that suggested they found her confidence either admirable or naive. Others seemed to be calculating the political implications of recommending a woman for a program that had traditionally been the exclusive domain of men. But Colonel Fletcher, who'd watched Kira develop from an enthusiastic teenager into a formidable young woman, leaned forward. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned his opinions through experience, "I've been evaluating potential pilots for over 20 years. I've seen hot shots who thought they were invincible washout in the first month. I've seen quiet kids who nobody believed in become legends. This young woman has something I've rarely seen: the combination of skill, determination, and character that makes the difference between good pilots and great ones. The recommendation carried weight. More importantly, it carried truth. When Kiera's acceptance letter arrived 3 months later, it marked not just her personal victory, but a small crack in the foundation of institutional resistance that had kept women out of combat roles for decades. The Air Force Academy was everything she'd expected and nothing she'd prepared for. The academic challenges were intense but manageable. Her high school preparation had been thorough. The physical demands were significant but not insurmountable. Her fitness regimen had been designed specifically for military requirements. But the social dynamics, the complex web of relationships and hierarchies that defined military culture, proved to be the most difficult terrain to navigate. She wasn't the only woman in her class, but she was one of the few openly committed to pursuing fighter aviation. The others faced their own challenges, some subtle, some overt, all designed to test not just their abilities but their resolve. Kiera watched as classmates who'd arrived with the same dreams she carried gradually shifted their focus to transport aircraft, support roles, or in some cases, civilian careers altogether. "You can't save everyone," her roommate, Lieutenant Patricia Chen, told her one evening after another female cadet had announced her intention to pursue a career in logistics rather than aviation. "Some people aren't willing to pay the price." "What price?" Kiera asked, though she already knew the answer. "The price of being first, the price of being scrutinized, the price of having to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified." It was a price Kiera had already committed to paying. Every flight hour, every academic challenge, every leadership opportunity became a chance to prove that her presence in the program wasn't a political statement or a social experiment. It was a strategic advantage for the Air Force. Her flight instructors noticed first. Captain Sarah Martinez, one of the few female pilots on the Academy staff, pulled Kiera aside after a particularly challenging training flight. "You know they're watching you," she said without preamble. "They're watching all of us." "No," Martinez corrected. "They're watching you. Your stick and rudder skills, your ability to think under pressure, your leadership in the cockpit. You're setting the standard for every woman who comes after you." The weight of that responsibility was both crushing and liberating. Crushing because it meant that every mistake would be magnified, every weakness exploited, every failure used as evidence that the entire gender was unsuited for combat aviation. Liberating because it meant that excellence wasn't just a personal goal, it was a mission. That mission became clearer during her final year at the Academy, when the Department of Defense began seriously considering lifting the ban on women in combat roles. The policy discussions were happening at levels far above her pay grade, but the implications were immediate and personal. If the ban were lifted, she could pursue her dream of flying fighters. If it remained in place, she'd be relegated to support roles regardless of her qualifications. "The thing about barriers," her tactics instructor, Major Robert Stone, told her class during a lecture on air-to-air combat, "is that they're designed to keep people out. But they're also designed to be broken by people who are determined enough, skilled enough, and brave enough to break them." He wasn't speaking directly to her, but Kiera felt the words like a personal challenge. She'd spent 4 years preparing for the possibility that she might never get the chance to prove herself in a fighter cockpit. Now, with graduation approaching and policy changes on the horizon, that possibility was becoming a probability. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 3 months before graduation. Assignment to undergraduate pilot training at Columbus Air Force Base, Mississippi, with a slot reserved for fighter track. It was everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of since that day at Kirtland when she'd pressed her face against the chain-link fence and watched an F-16 disappear into the blue. But it was also the beginning of the real test. The Academy had been preparation. UPT would be validation. And beyond that, if she succeeded, lay the fighter training unit where she'd learned to fly the most advanced combat aircraft in the world. where she'd earned the right to call herself a fighter pilot, where she'd discover whether 4 years of preparation had been enough to overcome decades of institutional resistance. The night before graduation, Kira stood on the cadet area, looking out at the Colorado landscape that had been her home for 4 years. Tomorrow, she'd be a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. In 6 months, she'd be in the cockpit of a T-38 Talon, learning to fly at speeds that would have been unimaginable to that 11-year-old girl who'd watched jets take off from Kirtland. But tonight, she was still a cadet, still carrying the dreams and doubts that had brought her this far. The stars above Colorado Springs were brilliant, unpolluted by the light of major cities. They reminded her of the nights she'd spent with her father, learning to identify constellations, talking about the future, planning for a career that had seemed impossible just a few years before. Her phone buzzed. A text from Miguel. "Proud of you, Mija. Tomorrow you get your wings, but you've been flying all your life." The message made her smile. In a few hours, she'd walk across the stage, receive her commission, and begin the journey that would eventually lead to that briefing room at Nellie's where General Castellanos would salute her achievements. But that journey would be anything but direct. It would be marked by challenges that would test not just her skills as a pilot, but her character as a leader, her resilience as a woman in a male-dominated field, and her ability to transform skepticism into respect. The path to becoming Phoenix had begun with a dream and a determination, but it would be forged in the crucible of flight training, where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds, and the difference between success and failure could be measured in lives. Undergraduate pilot training was designed to break people, not maliciously, but purposefully, to identify those who had the psychological makeup, the technical skills, and the sheer stubborn determination required to handle military aircraft in combat situations. The program had a 50% washout rate, and that statistic didn't discriminate based on gender, background, or pre-existing reputation. Second Lieutenant Kira Valdez arrived at Columbus Air Force Base on a muggy Mississippi morning in August, her silver bars fresh and her confidence carefully calibrated. She'd learned at the academy that projecting too much confidence was seen as arrogance, while too little was interpreted as weakness. The balance between these extremes was as delicate as controlling an aircraft in turbulence. The base was a sprawling complex of runways, hangars, and training facilities that had been producing Air Force pilots for over half a century. The morning air was thick with humidity, and the sound of T-6 Texan trainers practicing touch-and-go landings. To Kira, it sounded like music, the symphony of dreams becoming reality. Her class consisted of 24 students, representing the cream of the Air Force's commissioning programs. Academy graduates, ROTC standouts, and officer candidate school honorees. Each had excelled in their respective programs. Each had demonstrated the academic and physical capabilities necessary for military aviation. But only half would graduate, and of those, only a handful would be selected for fighter training. The first challenge came during academics: aviation physiology, aerodynamics, navigation, weather, emergency procedures. The curriculum was designed to provide a comprehensive foundation in the science and art of flight, but it was also designed to identify those who couldn't handle the intellectual demands of modern aviation. Kira approached the academic phase with the same methodical intensity she'd brought to everything else. While her classmates often studied in groups, she preferred to work alone, using the solitude to develop the mental discipline that would be essential in the cockpit. Her scores were consistently at the top of the class, but she knew that academic excellence was only the entry fee for the real challenge. That challenge came when she first strapped into the cockpit of a T-6 Texan. The aircraft was a single-engine, low-wing trainer that had been designed to introduce student pilots to the basics of military aviation. It was far from the supersonic fighters she hoped to fly eventually, but it was faster, more complex, and more demanding than anything she'd ever controlled. Her instructor pilot, Captain Mike Torch, Rodriguez, was a former F-16 pilot who transitioned to the training command after a tour in Afghanistan. He had the kind of easy confidence that came from having survived combat, along with the patience necessary to teach nervous students how to fly military aircraft without killing themselves. "Valdez," he said during their first briefing, "I've read your file. Academy graduate, top of your class, perfect scores on all the aptitude tests. That's all great, but none of it matters once we get airborne. The airplane doesn't care about your GPA or your fitness scores. It only cares about whether you can fly it safely and effectively." The first flight was a revelation. Despite years of preparation, despite countless hours in simulators, despite having dreamed of this moment since childhood, nothing had prepared her for the reality of military aviation. The T-6 was responsive, demanding, and utterly unforgiving of mistakes. Every control input had to be precise, every decision had to be correct, every reaction had to be instantaneous. "You're overthinking it," Rodriguez said through the intercom as Kira struggled to maintain straight and level flight during her first lesson. "Flying is about muscle memory, about developing the intuitive understanding of how the aircraft responds to your inputs. Right now, you're trying to think your way through every movement. That's not going to work when things get complicated." But complications were exactly what the program was designed to introduce. Formation flying, where she had to maintain precise positioning relative to other aircraft while managing her own flight path. Instrument flying, where she had to trust her instruments rather than her senses, navigating through clouds and weather using only electronic displays. Aerobatics, where she learned to control the aircraft in attitudes and conditions that defied normal experience. Each phase brought new challenges and new opportunities to fail. The washout rate was steady and merciless. Students who couldn't adapt to the demands of military aviation were eliminated without sentiment or second chances. Kira watched as classmates who'd seemed destined for success struggled with concepts that came naturally to her, while others who'd barely made it through the academic phase excelled in the cockpit. "It's not about being the smartest person in the room," Rodriguez told her during a post-flight debrief. "It's about being the most adaptable, the most resilient, the most willing to learn from your mistakes before they become disasters." The advice proved prophetic during her check ride for the formation phase. The evaluation was conducted by a senior instructor pilot who had a reputation for being particularly demanding. The mission required her to demonstrate precise formation flying, including close formation, tactical formation, and the ability to maintain position through various flight maneuvers. Everything went wrong. A radio failure early in the flight forced her to rely on visual signals from the lead aircraft. A weather system moved in faster than forecast, creating turbulence that made formation flying exponentially more difficult. And her evaluator, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, seemed determined to push her to the breaking point. "Valdez, you're too far out," he said over the intercom as she struggled to maintain position in the rough air. "Close it up. A combat formation is useless if you can't maintain proper spacing." She moved closer, fighting the turbulence that seemed determined to throw her aircraft around like a leaf in a hurricane. The lead aircraft, piloted by another instructor, executed a series of turns that required her to constantly adjust her position while maintaining the precise spacing that military formation flying demanded. "Better," Harrison said grudgingly. "Now let's see how you handle a rejoin." The rejoin was a maneuver that required her to fall back from formation, then rejoin from a tactical spacing. It was a procedure that fighter pilots used routinely, but for a student pilot in a T-6, it was one of the most challenging maneuvers in the curriculum. She executed the maneuver flawlessly, despite the continuing turbulence and the pressure of evaluation. Her spacing was perfect, her timing precise, her control inputs smooth and confident. For a moment, she felt the satisfaction of having mastered a particularly difficult skill. Then the emergency began. "Valdez, you've got a simulated engine failure," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that instructors used to turn routine training flights into tests of character. "Execute emergency procedures." Engine failure in a single-engine aircraft was the nightmare scenario that every pilot trained for but hoped never to experience. In the T-6, it meant she had perhaps 60 seconds to find a suitable landing site, configure the aircraft for a dead-stick landing, and execute an approach that would either save her life or end it. The academic knowledge was there. She'd memorized the emergency procedures, practiced them in simulators, discussed them in countless briefings. But applying that knowledge while flying a rapidly descending aircraft, with an instructor pilot evaluating every decision, was something entirely different. "Airspeed is life," she muttered, using the axiom that had been drilled into every pilot since the Wright brothers. She lowered the nose to maintain flying speed, began scanning for suitable landing sites, and started the process of configuring the aircraft for an emergency landing. The Mississippi landscape below was a patchwork of forests, farms, and small towns. None of it looked particularly inviting for an emergency landing, but that was the point of the exercise. Real emergencies rarely occurred in convenient locations. "There," she said, identifying a long, straight section of rural highway that appeared to be relatively free of traffic. "Highway 82, approximately 2 miles northwest of our position." "Why that site?" Harrison asked. "It's long enough for the landing roll, straight enough for approach, and appears to have minimal obstacles. The surface looks hard enough to support the aircraft weight." "Acceptable. Execute your approach." The next few minutes were a blur of precise calculations and careful control inputs. She had to manage her descent rate to arrive at the highway with enough altitude to execute a safe landing, but not so much that she'd overshoot her target. She had to configure the aircraft for minimum sink rate while maintaining enough airspeed to retain control authority. And she had to do it all while maintaining the kind of situational awareness that would be essential in a real emergency. "Landing gear," Harrison prompted. "Gear down increases drag but provides better protection for the occupants. Given the hard surface, I'm opting for gear down." "Flaps." "Full flaps for minimum landing speed, but I'll maintain enough airspeed to retain control authority through touchdown." The approach was textbook perfect. She arrived at the highway with exactly the right altitude, airspeed, and configuration for a safe landing. The simulated touchdown was smooth, the rollout straight, and the aircraft came to a stop well within the available runway distance. "Secure the aircraft," Harrison instructed. She ran through the shutdown procedures, configuring the T-6 for a safe shutdown and emergency egress. When she was finished, the cockpit was silent except for the sound of her own breathing and the background noise of the intercom system. "Valdez," Harrison said after a long pause, "that was a textbook emergency procedure. Your decision-making was sound, your execution was precise, and your prioritization was exactly what we're looking for in a military pilot." The relief was overwhelming. She'd passed one of the most challenging evaluations in the program, had demonstrated the kind of performance under pressure that would be essential in combat situations. But more importantly, she'd proven to herself that she could handle the unexpected, could adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, could make life-and-death decisions while maintaining the precision and professionalism that military aviation demanded. The success carried her through the remainder of the T-6 phase and into the advanced training phase, where she would fly the T-38 Talon. The T-38 was a different aircraft entirely, a twin-engine, supersonic trainer that was designed to prepare students for the high-performance aircraft they would eventually fly in operational units. Her first flight in the T-38 was a revelation. The aircraft was faster, more responsive, and more demanding than anything she'd previously flown. The takeoff acceleration pressed her back into her seat with a force that was both exhilarating and intimidating. The climb rate was phenomenal, carrying her to altitudes where the sky began to darken and the curvature of the earth became visible. "This is what it's all about," her new instructor pilot, Major Lisa Viper Patterson, said over the intercom. "The T-38 will teach you to think fast, react faster, and fly with the kind of precision that fighter aviation demands." Patterson was a former F-15 pilot who transitioned to the training command after a distinguished career in Air Combat Command. She was one of the few female instructor pilots in the program, and her presence provided both inspiration and validation for Kira's aspirations. "You know they're watching you," Patterson said during a post-flight debrief. "Not just your performance, but your attitude, your professionalism, your ability to handle the pressure of being different." "I know." "Good, because if you succeed here, if you make it through to fighter training, you'll be opening doors for other women. And if you fail, those doors might close for a generation." The pressure was immense, but it was also clarifying. Every flight became an opportunity to prove that gender was irrelevant to piloting ability. Every maneuver became a chance to demonstrate that excellence was defined by skill, not demographics. Every challenge became a platform for showing that the sky belonged to anyone with the talent and determination to claim it. The T-38 phase introduced her to the world of supersonic flight, where the rules were different and the margins for error were measured in milliseconds. She learned to fly in close formation at speeds that would have been unimaginable just months before. She mastered instrument approaches in weather conditions that would have grounded civilian aircraft. She practiced combat maneuvers that were designed to prepare her for the three-dimensional chess game of air-to-air combat. But it was during the final phase of training, the capstone flight that would determine whether she would be selected for fighter training, that she truly discovered what it meant to be a military pilot. The mission was complex, a high-altitude intercept followed by a low-level navigation route, concluding with a precision approach in challenging weather conditions. It was designed to test every skill she developed during her time in UPT, to push her to the limits of her abilities, and to evaluate her performance under the kind of pressure she'd face in operational flying. The intercept went flawlessly. She found her target aircraft at 30,000 feet, executed a perfect conversion to an attack position, and demonstrated the kind of tactical awareness that would be essential in combat. The low-level route was equally successful. She navigated through the Mississippi countryside at 500 feet and 400 knots, hitting every checkpoint within the specified time tolerances. But it was the approach that nearly ended her career before it began. The weather had deteriorated while she was flying the low-level route. What had been forecast as scattered clouds and light rain had become a full-scale thunderstorm system with embedded severe weather, low ceilings, and visibility that was rapidly approaching minimums for the approach. Valdez-Columbus approach, weather is now ceiling 800 overcast, visibility 3 miles in moderate rain, wind 180 at 15 gusting to 25. Advise intentions. The decision point had arrived. She could request vectors to an alternate airfield with better weather, which would be the safe and reasonable choice, but would also mean failing to complete the mission as briefed. Or she could execute the approach to Columbus, which would be challenging but within the published minimums for the aircraft and her qualification level. Columbus approach, Valdez requesting vectors for the ILS approach to runway 18. Valdez, be advised the approach is at minimums and deteriorating. You have alternate airfields available with better weather. Understood, requesting approach clearance. The next 20 minutes were the most intense of her flying career to that point. The approach required her to navigate through moderate turbulence while maintaining precise altitude and heading control. The rain hammered against the canopy with a force that made communication difficult. The wind was gusting strong enough to require constant control inputs to maintain the approach path. At decision height, the altitude where she would either see the runway or execute a missed approach, The runway environment was barely visible through the rain and mist. She had perhaps 5 seconds to make a decision that would affect the rest of her career. She continued the approach. The landing was far from graceful. The gusting wind required her to maintain a significant crab angle until the last moment, when she had to quickly align the aircraft with the runway centerline. The touchdown was firm but controlled, and the rollout was complicated by standing water that made braking less effective than normal. But she was down safely, and more importantly, she had completed the mission as briefed despite challenging conditions. Valdez Tower, nice work on that approach. Taxi to the ramp when able. The post-flight debrief was extensive. Her instructor pilot, Major Patterson, went through every aspect of the flight in detail: the successful intercept, the precise navigation, and the challenging approach. But it was the weather decision that dominated the discussion. "You had alternatives," Patterson said. "You could have diverted to Meridian or Jackson, completed the flight safely, and nobody would have questioned your judgment." "Yes, ma'am." "So why didn't you?" The question hung in the air like the humidity that had made the approach so challenging. Kira considered her answer carefully, knowing that it would reveal something fundamental about her character and her approach to military aviation. "Ma'am, the mission was to complete the profile as briefed. The weather was challenging but within limits. I felt that I had the skills and the aircraft capability to complete the approach safely. And if you'd been wrong, then I would have executed a missed approach and diverted to an alternate field. But I was confident in my ability to complete the mission." Patterson nodded slowly. Confidence is essential in military aviation, but so is judgment. The ability to know when to push forward and when to accept that discretion is the better part of valor. "Yes, ma'am." "In this case, your judgment was sound. Your execution was professional, and your completion of the mission under challenging conditions demonstrated the kind of performance we're looking for in fighter pilots." The words were like music. After months of training, after countless hours in the cockpit, after proving herself again and again, she had finally earned the recognition that mattered most: the acknowledgement that she had the skills necessary to succeed in fighter aviation. The assignment to Luke Air Force Base in Arizona came 3 weeks later. F-16 training. The Fighting Falcon. The aircraft that had inspired her childhood dreams was now going to be her reality. She would be part of the first class of female pilots to train in the F-16, a fact that carried both tremendous opportunity and enormous pressure. Luke AFB was a sprawling complex in the Arizona desert, home to the largest fighter training wing in the Air Force. The base had been training F-16 pilots for over 2 decades, and the program had developed a reputation for producing some of the finest fighter pilots in the world. The standards were exacting, the training intense, and the washout rate significant even for pilots who had already proven themselves in undergraduate pilot training. First Lieutenant Kira Valdez arrived at Luke on a scorching August morning, the desert heat already shimmering off the tarmac at 800 hours. The flight line was filled with F-16s in various stages of preparation, some being pre-flight inspected, others returning from training missions, still others being maintained by the army of technicians who kept the complex aircraft mission-ready. The sight of them took her breath away. The F-16 was a thing of beauty, all sharp angles and purposeful lines, designed for one thing: air-to-air combat. The aircraft looked fast even when standing still, like a thoroughbred racehorse waiting for the starting gate to open. Each one represented the culmination of decades of aerospace engineering, millions of dollars in taxpayer investment, and the collective expertise of thousands of people who had dedicated their careers to building the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. "Impressive, isn't it?" The voice came from behind her, causing her to turn around. A tall, lean man in a flight suit approached, his walk carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd been flying fighters for years. The name tag on his chest read Mongoose, and the rank insignia on his shoulders marked him as a lieutenant colonel. "Yes, sir," she replied, coming to attention. "At ease, Lieutenant. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Rick Mongoose Thompson, Assistant Operations Officer for the 56th Fighter Wing. I'll be one of your instructor pilots during your time here." Thompson had the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. His flight suit was immaculate, his bearing professional, and his eyes held the kind of alertness that came from years of high-performance flying. But there was something else in his expression, a calculation, an evaluation, as if he were trying to determine whether she belonged here or was simply another social experiment that would wash out in a few weeks. "Lieutenant Valdez," he said, consulting a clipboard, "I've reviewed your training records from Columbus. Impressive academic scores, strong flight performance, good judgment under pressure. But I have to tell you, the F-16 is a different animal entirely. Everything you've learned up to this point has been preparation for this. The real test starts now." The first phase of F-16 training was academic, but unlike the classroom work at UPT, this was specific, detailed, and intensely focused on the systems and capabilities of the aircraft she would soon be flying. The F-16 was far more complex than anything she'd previously encountered. The avionics systems alone were more sophisticated than entire aircraft from previous generations. The weapons systems were designed to engage multiple targets simultaneously at ranges that would have been impossible just decades before. Her class consisted of 12 pilots, all graduates of UPT, all selected for fighter training based on their performance in the T-38. But she was the only woman, a fact that was both obvious and carefully ignored by the instructors who seemed determined to treat her exactly like any other student. The academics were intensive. Aircraft systems, emergency procedures, tactical employment, threat recognition, weapons employment. The curriculum was designed to provide a comprehensive understanding of every aspect of F-16 operations. The pace was relentless, the standards unforgiving, and the expectation was that every pilot would master every system to the point where their responses became instinctive. Kiera approached the academic phase with the same methodical intensity she'd brought to every previous challenge. While her classmates often studied in groups, she continued to prefer working alone, using the solitude to develop the deep understanding of aircraft systems that would be essential when she began flying. Her scores were consistently at the top of the class, but she knew that academic excellence would count for nothing if she couldn't translate that knowledge into effective performance in the cockpit. The first flight was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in September. The pre-flight briefing was conducted by Major Sarah Venom Martinez, a former F-16 pilot who transitioned to the training command after completing multiple combat deployments. Martinez was one of the few female instructor pilots in the program, and her presence provided both inspiration and a sobering reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. "This is not a T-38, Martinez said, her tone making it clear that she'd seen too many students make the mistake of assuming their previous experience had prepared them for the reality of flying a frontline fighter aircraft. "The F-16 is faster, more powerful, and more demanding than anything you've flown before. It will expose every weakness in your flying technique, every gap in your knowledge, every moment of inattention or complacency." The briefing covered every aspect of the planned flight: startup procedures, taxi techniques, takeoff parameters, the planned training area, and the specific maneuvers they would practice. But it was the emergency procedures that dominated the discussion, the various failures that could occur, the immediate actions required, and the decision-making process that could mean the difference between a successful recovery and a catastrophic accident. "Questions?" Martinez asked when the briefing was complete. "No, ma'am," Kiera replied, her voice steady despite the anticipation that was building in her chest like pressure in a hydraulic system. The walk to the aircraft was surreal. After years of dreaming about this moment, after months of preparation, after countless hours of study and simulation, She was about to strap into the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon. The aircraft assigned to her training flight was tail number 870257, a Block 30 F-16C that had been delivered to the Air Force in 1987. It was older than she was, but it had been meticulously maintained and upgraded with the latest avionics and weapons systems. The pre-flight inspection was thorough and methodical. Every external component, every access panel, every control surface was examined for signs of damage, wear, or malfunction. The inspection was part technical evaluation and part ritual, a way of connecting with the aircraft, of developing the intimate familiarity that would be essential when flying at the edge of performance. "Take your time," Martinez said as Kira worked her way around the aircraft. "This is your first chance to really understand what you're about to fly. The F-16 is a machine, but it's also a partner. The better you know it, the better it will serve you." The cockpit was a marvel of engineering efficiency. Every switch, every display, every control had been positioned for maximum accessibility and minimum pilot workload. The heads-up display projected critical flight information directly onto the pilot's line of sight, allowing her to maintain situational awareness without looking down at instruments. The multifunction displays provided access to navigation, weapons, and aircraft systems information through a series of menus and pages that would become second nature with time and practice. "Comfortable?" Martinez asked as Kira settled into the ejection seat. "Yes, ma'am." "Good, because once we get airborne, comfort becomes irrelevant. The F-16 demands your complete attention, your total focus, and your absolute commitment to flying the aircraft to its limits." The engine start was unlike anything she'd experienced before. The F-100 turbofan engine that powered the F-16 was a masterpiece of engineering, capable of producing over 25,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner engaged. The startup sequence was precise and methodical, each step verified before proceeding to the next. When the engine finally reached idle power, the aircraft seemed to come alive, every system humming with the kind of barely contained energy that suggested tremendous capability. Taxi clearance came from the tower, and Kira began the process of moving the aircraft from the parking area to the active runway. The F-16's nose-wheel steering was sensitive, requiring gentle control inputs to maintain precise directional control. The aircraft's low stance and bubble canopy provided excellent visibility, but the sensation of sitting on top of so much power was both exhilarating and intimidating. "Luke Tower, Venom 21, ready for takeoff." Venom 21, Luke Tower, wind calm, runway 21 left, cleared for takeoff. The takeoff was a revelation. Martinez had briefed her on the performance characteristics of the F-16, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of afterburner acceleration. When she pushed the throttle forward past the military power setting into the afterburner range, the aircraft lunged forward with a force that pressed her back into her seat with crushing intensity. The acceleration was relentless, building speed at a rate that seemed to defy physics. "Rotate," Martinez called over the intercom, and Kira pulled back on the stick, feeling the aircraft lift off the runway with an eagerness that was almost alive. The climb rate was phenomenal, carrying them to altitude at a pace that made the T-38 seem pedestrian by comparison. "How does it feel?" Martinez asked once they'd reached their assigned training altitude. "Like nothing I've ever experienced," Kira replied, her voice filled with wonder and respect for the machine she was now controlling. "Good, because this is just the beginning. Today we're going to explore the basic flight characteristics. Tomorrow we'll start learning how to employ this aircraft as a weapon system." The next hour was a systematic exploration of the F-16's capabilities. Basic aircraft handling, turns, climbs, descents, and the fundamental maneuvers that would form the foundation of everything she would learn in the months ahead. The aircraft was responsive beyond anything she'd previously flown, reacting to control inputs with an immediacy that required constant attention and precise technique. The F-16 is dynamically unstable, Martinez explained as they practiced various maneuvers. That means it wants to depart controlled flight, and only the flight control computers keep it stable. If you fight the aircraft, if you try to over-control it, it will bite you. But if you work with it, if you understand its characteristics and respect its capabilities, it will do things that seem impossible. The lesson was profound and would prove prophetic. The F-16 was not just a machine to be operated. It was a partner to be understood, a weapon system to be mastered, and a challenge to be overcome. Every flight would be a learning experience, every maneuver a chance to develop the intuitive understanding that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. Landing was another revelation. The F-16's approach characteristics were different from anything she'd previously flown. The aircraft had a tendency to float in ground effect, requiring precise airspeed and attitude control to achieve a smooth touchdown. The landing gear was designed for carrier operations that the F-16 would never perform, but the robust construction meant that less-than-perfect landings were survivable. "Not bad for a first flight," Martinez said during the post-flight debrief. "You showed good aircraft control, appropriate caution, and the kind of adaptability that suggests you'll do well in this program." But the real test was still ahead. The basic aircraft handling phase was just the foundation for the tactical employment phase, where she would learn to use the F-16 as it was designed to be used, as an air-to-air fighter capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously at beyond visual range. The weapons systems training began 3 weeks later. The F-16 carried an array of air-to-air missiles, each designed for specific engagement scenarios. The AIM-120 AMRAAM was a radar-guided missile capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 50 miles. The AIM-9 Sidewinder was a heat-seeking missile designed for close-range combat. The M61 Vulcan cannon provided a backup weapons system for situations where missiles were either unavailable or inappropriate. But it was the radar system that truly defined the F-16's capabilities. The AN/APG-68 radar could track multiple targets simultaneously, providing the pilot with a comprehensive picture of the tactical situation. The system could detect, track, and engage targets while maintaining situational awareness of the broader air battle. Learning to operate the radar effectively was like learning to play three-dimensional chess while flying at 500 miles per hour. Air-to-air combat is about information management, explained Captain James "Ripper" Sullivan, her instructor for the weapons systems phase. The pilot who has the best situational awareness, who can process multiple sources of information simultaneously, and who can make tactical decisions faster than the enemy, that pilot wins. The training progression was systematic and unforgiving. First, she learned to operate the radar system, to detect and track targets, to understand the various display modes and symbology that would be essential in combat. Then came weapons employment training, learning to select the appropriate weapon for each engagement scenario, to achieve proper positioning for weapons release, and to evaluate the effectiveness of her attacks. The simulator training was intensive, but it was the live-fire training that truly tested her skills. Flying to the Goldwater Range in Arizona, she practiced engaging aerial targets with live missiles, learning to translate the theoretical knowledge of weapons employment into practical skill. The first time she fired an AIM-120 AMRAAM and watched it guide to a successful intercept of a remotely piloted target, she felt the satisfaction of having mastered one of the most complex weapon systems in the world. But it was during the air-to-air combat training that she truly discovered what it meant to be a fighter pilot. The training involved flying against other F-16s in scenarios designed to replicate the challenges of real combat. The engagements were conducted with simulated weapons, but the tactics, techniques, and procedures were identical to those used in actual combat. Her first engagement was against Captain Mike "Hawk" Davis, an experienced F-16 pilot who completed multiple combat deployments. The scenario was basic, a beyond visual range engagement where each pilot would attempt to detect, track, and engage the other using radar and simulated AMRAAM missiles. "Fights on," came the call from the range control officer, and the engagement began. Kira immediately began the process of finding her opponent on radar. The F-16's radar was powerful, but it was also complex, requiring constant attention to maintain situational awareness while managing the aircraft's flight path. She found Davis's aircraft at 35 miles, achieved a radar lock, and began the process of maneuvering for an optimal missile shot. But Davis was experienced, and he was already implementing electronic countermeasures designed to break her radar lock. The engagement became a three-dimensional chess match, with both pilots maneuvering for advantage while trying to maintain their own defensive posture. "Venom 22, Fox 3, she called, indicating a simulated AMRAAM shot. The missile guidance was evaluated by the range instrumentation, and the result was immediate. "Venom 22, kill. Hawk 31, you're dead." The satisfaction was overwhelming. She'd successfully engaged and defeated an experienced opponent in her first air-to-air combat training flight. But the victory was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. Real combat would be far more complex, with multiple opponents, electronic jamming, and the kind of life-and-death pressure that no training could fully replicate. The training continued for 6 months, each phase building on the previous one. Air-to-ground combat, where she learned to employ precision-guided munitions against ground targets. Electronic warfare, where she learned to operate in environments where the enemy was actively trying to deny her the use of electronic systems. Formation flying, where she learned to operate as part of a larger strike package with multiple aircraft and mission objectives. But it was the final check ride that would determine whether she would graduate from F-16 training and be assigned to an operational fighter squadron. The evaluation was conducted by Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, the same officer who'd greeted her on her first day at Luke. The mission was complex, a simulated combat scenario that would test every skill she developed during her months of training. "This is not a training flight," Thompson briefed her before the mission. "This is an evaluation of your readiness to employ the F-16 in combat. I'll be playing the role of an enemy fighter, and my job is to defeat you using every tactical advantage available. Your job is to complete the mission objectives while defending yourself against my attacks." The scenario was challenging, a simulated strike mission against a heavily defended target, with Thompson playing the role of an enemy interceptor trying to prevent her from reaching the target. She would have to navigate through hostile airspace, defeat his attempts to intercept her, successfully attack the target, and return to base. The mission began with a low-level ingress, flying at high speed and low altitude to avoid detection by simulated enemy radar systems. The F-16 was ideally suited for this type of flying, its small size and advanced avionics making it difficult to detect and track. But she knew that Thompson was out there somewhere, using every advantage his experience provided to find and engage her. The intercept came at the most challenging point of the mission, just as she was beginning her attack run on the target. Thompson's aircraft appeared on her radar warning receiver, indicating that he had achieved a radar lock and was preparing to engage with simulated weapons. "Venom 22, notch right, chaff," she called, implementing defensive maneuvers designed to break his radar lock. The engagement became a high-speed, high-G battle of wits and skill, with both aircraft pulling forces that would have been lethal to unprotected human beings. But she'd learned her lessons well, using the terrain to mask her approach, employing electronic countermeasures to disrupt his targeting systems, and leveraging the F-16's superior maneuverability. She managed to reverse the engagement and achieve a firing solution on Thompson's aircraft. "Venom 22, Fox 2, she called, indicating a simulated AIM-9 shot. Venom 22, kill. Mongoose 11, you're dead. The mission continued with her successfully attacking the target and returning to base. But it was the engagement with Thompson that would be remembered. She'd not only survived an attack by an experienced opponent, but had successfully counterattacked and achieved a kill. The post-flight debrief was extensive. Thompson went through every aspect of the mission in detail, analyzing her tactical decisions, her technical performance, and her overall readiness for operational flying. But it was his final assessment that mattered most. "Lieutenant Valdez," he said, his tone carrying the weight of professional evaluation, "you have demonstrated the skills, knowledge, and judgment necessary to employ the F-16 in combat. You understand the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. You can operate effectively in a high-threat environment, and you have the tactical awareness necessary to survive and succeed in air-to-air combat." The words were like a benediction. After months of training, after countless hours in the cockpit, after proving herself again and again, she had finally earned the qualification that mattered most, the designation of combat-ready F-16 pilot. The assignment to Spangdahlem Air Base in Germany came 2 weeks later. The 52nd Fighter Wing, one of the Air Force's premier fighter units, with a mission that included both air-to-air and air-to-ground operations in support of NATO and U.S. strategic objectives. She would be flying the F-16C Block 50, the most advanced version of the Fighting Falcon, equipped with the latest avionics and weapons systems. But more importantly, she would be flying in an operational squadron, where the training would end and the real work would begin, where she would discover whether all the preparation, all the study, all the practice had been sufficient to prepare her for the reality of being a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force. The flight to Germany was conducted in an F-16, her first transatlantic crossing in a single-seat fighter. The journey required multiple aerial refueling operations, precise navigation across the Atlantic Ocean, and the kind of endurance that tested both pilot and aircraft. But when she finally saw the European coastline appear on the horizon, when she began her descent into Spangdahlem, she felt the satisfaction of having completed another milestone in her journey. The 52nd Fighter Wing was everything she'd hoped for and more challenging than she'd expected. The mission tempo was intense, with daily training flights, monthly exercises, and the constant readiness requirements that came with being part of America's forward-deployed forces. The pilots were experienced, professional, and initially skeptical of the young female pilot who'd been assigned to their squadron. "So you're the diversity hire," said Captain Rick "Viper" Johnson during her first squadron meeting. The comment was delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that was supposed to pass for humor in military aviation, but Kira recognized it for what it was, a test of her character, her resilience, and her ability to function in an environment where acceptance had to be earned rather than assumed. "I'm the pilot," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to build in her system. "Same as you." The exchange set the tone for her first months in the squadron. She was competent, qualified, and capable of performing every mission assigned to her. But she was also different, and difference in military aviation was often viewed with suspicion rather than acceptance. Every flight became an opportunity to prove herself, every mission a chance to demonstrate that her presence was an asset rather than a liability. The first real test came during a NATO exercise in Poland. The scenario was complex, a simulated air-to-air engagement involving multiple aircraft from different nations, each with their own capabilities, limitations, and tactical procedures. Kira was assigned to fly wing position for Major Tom Razor Mitchell, an experienced pilot who'd completed multiple combat deployments. "Stay close, don't get in the way, and try not to embarrass us," Mitchell briefed her before the mission. The instructions were supposed to be helpful, but they carried the unmistakable implication that he expected her to be a liability rather than an asset. The mission began with a formation takeoff, 4 F-16s launching simultaneously and joining up in tactical formation. The coordination required was precise, with each pilot maintaining exact positioning relative to the others while monitoring radio communications, navigation systems, and potential threats. The engagement area was over the Baltic Sea, where they would face off against Eurofighter Typhoons from the German Air Force. The Typhoon was a formidable opponent, with advanced radar systems, sophisticated missiles, and pilots who were among the best in Europe. The engagement would be a true test of tactics, technique, and individual skill. Bandits bearing 30, 40 miles high, came the call from the E-3 AWACS aircraft providing battle management for the exercise. The enemy aircraft had been detected, and the engagement was about to begin. Mitchell immediately began maneuvering his formation to achieve an advantageous position for the engagement. As his wingman, Kira's job was to maintain formation, provide mutual support, and be ready to engage targets of opportunity. But she was also expected to maintain situational awareness of the entire tactical picture and be prepared to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. The engagement developed quickly. The Typhoons were employing sophisticated tactics, using their superior radar systems to achieve early detection while implementing electronic countermeasures to disrupt the F-16's targeting systems. The battle became a three-dimensional chess match, with both sides maneuvering for advantage while trying to maintain their own defensive posture. Razor 11, defending, notch left, Mitchell called, indicating that he was under attack and implementing defensive maneuvers. The engagement had become chaotic, with multiple aircraft maneuvering at high speed and high G-forces while trying to achieve firing solutions on their opponents. Kira found herself in the position every wingman dreaded. Her flight lead was engaged defensively, unable to provide mutual support, and she was facing a Typhoon that was maneuvering for a weapons solution. The next few seconds would determine whether she could successfully defend herself and her flight lead, or whether both would be eliminated from the exercise. The Typhoon pilot was skilled, using his aircraft's superior climb rate and acceleration to achieve an advantageous position. But Kira had learned her lessons well at Luke, and she began implementing the defensive tactics that had been drilled into her during training. Razor 12, defending, cranking right, she called, indicating her own defensive posture while maneuvering to maintain mutual support with Mitchell. The engagement became a high-speed, high-G battle of wits and skill, with both aircraft pulling forces that pushed the limits of human endurance. But she'd spotted an opportunity. The Typhoon pilot, focused on achieving a weapon solution, had positioned himself in a way that left him vulnerable to a counterattack. Using the F-16's superior maneuverability and her own tactical awareness, she managed to reverse the engagement and achieve a firing solution. Razor 12, Fox 2, she called, indicating a simulated AIM-9 shot. Razor 12, kill. Luftwaffe 33, you're dead. The engagement continued, but the tide had turned. With the Typhoon eliminated, she was able to provide mutual support for Mitchell, who successfully engaged and eliminated his opponent. The exercise concluded with both F-16s returning to base, having successfully completed their mission objectives. The post-flight debrief was extensive. The exercise controllers went through every aspect of the engagement in detail, analyzing the tactical decisions, technical performance, and overall effectiveness of both sides. But it was Mitchell's assessment that mattered most to Kira. "Not bad, Phoenix," he said, using her call sign for the first time. "You showed good situational awareness, effective defensive tactics, and the kind of aggressive counterattack that wins air-to-air engagements." The use of her call sign was significant. In fighter aviation, call signs were earned through performance, not assigned through bureaucracy. The fact that Mitchell had used hers was an indication that she was beginning to earn acceptance in the squadron. The call sign, Phoenix, had been given to her during her first month at Spangdahlem, after a particularly challenging training flight where she'd successfully recovered from a simulated emergency that had been designed to test her decision-making under pressure. The name was supposed to reference her ability to rise from challenging situations, but it had also become a symbol of her determination to succeed despite the obstacles she faced. The months that followed were a progression of increasingly challenging missions and growing acceptance within the squadron. She flew training missions throughout Europe, participated in international exercises, and gradually earned the respect of her fellow pilots through consistent performance and professional competence. But it was the deployment to the Middle East that would truly test her skills and establish her reputation as a combat pilot. The 52nd Fighter Wing was tasked with supporting Operation Southern Watch, the no-fly zone enforcement mission over southern Iraq. The deployment would involve flying combat missions over hostile territory, with the constant possibility of engaging enemy aircraft or surface-to-air missile systems. The briefing for the deployment was conducted by Colonel James Hammer Harrison, the wing commander who'd overseen her transition from training to operational flying. Harrison was a veteran of multiple combat deployments, with the kind of experience that came from years of flying fighters in hostile environments. "This is not training," he told the assembled pilots. "This is combat operations, with real threats, real weapons, and real consequences. The Iraqi Air Force may be limited, but their surface-to-air missile systems are sophisticated and lethal. Their operators are experienced, and they've been trying to shoot down American aircraft for over a decade." The deployment to Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia was Kira's first experience with combat operations. The base was a sprawling complex in the desert, with multiple runways, hardened aircraft shelters, and the kind of security measures that reflected the ongoing threat from hostile forces. The mission tempo was intense, with daily combat air patrols over southern Iraq and the constant readiness requirements that came with operating in a hostile environment. Her first combat mission was a routine patrol over the no-fly zone, flying in formation with 3 other F-16s and providing air cover for reconnaissance aircraft mapping Iraqi military installations. The mission was supposed to be routine, but in combat operations, routine could become extraordinary in seconds. Viper 11, this is Magic 62. I'm tracking multiple SAM sites coming active, bearing 40 miles north of your position, came the call from the E-3 AWACS aircraft providing battle management for the mission. The Iraqi surface-to-air missile systems were illuminating American aircraft with their targeting radars, a clear indication of hostile intent. Viper 11, Roger, we're maneuvering to avoid the threat, replied Major Davidson, the flight lead. The formation immediately began implementing defensive procedures, using terrain masking and electronic countermeasures to avoid detection by the Iraqi missile systems. But the situation was about to become significantly more complex. Viper Flight, Magic 62, I'm tracking 2 Iraqi MiG-29s, bearing 20 miles north of your position, high, fast, and heading your way. The Iraqi Air Force was challenging the no-fly zone, sending 2 of their most capable fighters to engage the American patrol. The MiG-29 was a formidable opponent, with advanced radar systems, sophisticated missiles, and pilots who were experienced in operating Soviet-era aircraft. The engagement would be a true test of tactics, technique, and individual skill. Viper Flight, engage as targeted, Davidson ordered, and the formation began maneuvering for an optimal engagement. As the newest member of the flight, Kira was assigned to provide mutual support and engage targets of opportunity, but she was also expected to maintain situational awareness of the entire tactical picture and be prepared to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. The engagement developed quickly. The MiG-29s were employing sophisticated tactics, using their superior climb rate and acceleration to achieve an advantageous position, while implementing electronic countermeasures to disrupt the F-16's targeting systems. The battle became a three-dimensional chess match, with both sides maneuvering for advantage while trying to maintain their own defensive posture. Viper 11, Fox 3, Davidson called, indicating an AMRAAM shot at one of the MiGs. The missile guidance was provided by the F-16's radar, but the Iraqi pilot was already implementing defensive maneuvers designed to break the radar lock. Kira found herself engaged with the second MiG-29, which was maneuvering aggressively to achieve a weapons solution. The Iraqi pilot was skilled, using his aircraft's superior performance at high altitude to maintain an advantageous position. But Kira had learned her lessons well, and she began implementing the tactics that had been drilled into her during training. Viper 12, Fox 3, she called, indicating her own AMRAAM shot. The missile guided successfully, and the Iraqi aircraft was eliminated from the engagement. Her first combat kill, her first validation that all the training, all the preparation, all the sacrifice had been worthwhile. The engagement concluded with both Iraqi aircraft eliminated and all American aircraft returning safely to base. But it was the post-mission debrief that would prove most significant for Kira's career. The mission commanders were impressed not just with her technical performance, but with her tactical awareness, her ability to maintain situational awareness under pressure, and her aggressive prosecution of the engagement. "Lieutenant Valdez," said Colonel Harrison during the debrief, "you demonstrated exactly the kind of performance we expect from our combat pilots. Your situational awareness was outstanding, your tactical decisions were sound, and your weapons employment was textbook perfect." The words were like a benediction. After years of training, after months of proving herself, after countless hours in the cockpit, she had finally earned the recognition that mattered most: acknowledgement as a combat-proven fighter pilot. The deployment continued for 4 months, with routine patrols occasionally interrupted by Iraqi challenges to the no-fly zone. Each mission was an opportunity to refine her skills, to develop the intuitive understanding of air-to-air combat that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. By the end of the deployment, she had accumulated over 100 combat hours and had earned the respect of every pilot in the squadron. But it was the mission that would make her famous, the single flight that would transform her from a competent pilot into a legend, that was still months away. The mission that would demonstrate not just her individual skill, but her ability to adapt to the unexpected, to make split-second decisions under pressure, and to accomplish the impossible when the stakes were highest. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. Intelligence had identified a high-value target in a remote area of Iraq, a facility that was believed to be involved in the development of weapons of mass destruction. The target was heavily defended, surrounded by multiple layers of surface-to-air missile systems, and protected by the kind of overlapping defenses that made conventional attack extremely difficult. The mission planning was complex. A strike package consisting of multiple aircraft would be required to neutralize the defensive systems, suppress enemy air defenses, and deliver precision-guided munitions against the target. The timing would be critical, the coordination essential, and the margin for error virtually non-existent. Kira was assigned to fly as part of the suppression of enemy air defenses package, tasked with eliminating the SA-6 missile systems that protected the target area. The SA-6 was a sophisticated weapon system, with advanced radar capabilities and missiles that were lethal to aircraft operating at medium altitudes. Neutralizing these systems would be essential to the success of the overall mission. But the mission would be unlike anything she'd previously flown. The target was deep in hostile territory, beyond the range of most support aircraft. The weather forecast was marginal, with low ceilings and reduced visibility that would complicate both navigation and weapons employment. Most significantly, intelligence indicated that the Iraqis were expecting an attack and had positioned additional defensive systems specifically to counter American air operations. The briefing was conducted by Colonel Harrison, who emphasized the importance of the mission and the challenges that lay ahead. "This is not a routine patrol," he told the assembled pilots. "This is a strategic strike against a target that poses a direct threat to American interests. The defenses are sophisticated, the threat is real, and the consequences of failure are significant." The mission launched at 400 hours, with 16 aircraft participating in the strike package. F-16s for suppression of enemy air defenses, F-15Es for precision strikes against the target, EA-6B Prowlers for electronic warfare support, and KC-135 tankers for aerial refueling. The coordination required was precise, with each aircraft performing specific functions while maintaining the tactical formation necessary for mutual support. Kiera's F-16 was loaded with AGM-88 HARM missiles, specifically designed to home in on enemy radar systems and destroy them before they could engage friendly aircraft. The missiles were sophisticated weapons, capable of detecting and tracking radar emissions from dozens of miles away. But they were also unforgiving. Once launched, they would guide to whatever radar system was emitting, regardless of whether it was the intended target. The ingress to the target area was conducted at low altitude, using terrain masking to avoid detection by Iraqi radar systems. The F-16 was ideally suited for this type of flying, its small size and advanced navigation systems making it difficult to detect and track. But as they approached the target area, the defensive systems began to come alive. Viper 12, I'm showing multiple SA.